Welcome everyone to Choice Conversations, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your life, one choice at a time. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. Let's do this. All right, gang. Today I've got a book review for you. It's The 1 Minute Manager from Ken Blanchard and Spencer Johnson. It's kind of a classic, pretty well-known, #1 bestseller, yada, 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 about managing people. And it offers efficient, fast, effective ways for getting people to produce for you. So the methods are also useful for people who are in any leadership position, including like a parental role. So we're going to dive into that, see what's good, see what's not good in a minute here. Before I do that, though, I did want to say thank you to the people that are contributing to Choice Conversations via Patreon. So if you're not aware, the best way to support the show is patreon.com/choiceconversations. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. There you can sign up and get access to some great bonus content for Choice Conversations. So if you'd like to get more from me, if you'd like to help out, if you appreciate the show and want to reciprocate, Patreon is the way to do it. All right, so let's dive into this book review. So one of the there's a couple principles at the top of the book that are important to discuss, I think, before we dive into what the actual methods are within. They talk about the different styles of managers, and they have the most common are are managers that are interested in people. They want to be like friendly with the people and the like, and they're kind of pushovers and don't get much results for the company they're representing, right? And then there are managers that are interested in results, and these are the ones that are typically viewed as being kind of hard asses that aren't really concerned about the welfare of the people that work for them. They just want to get as much out of them as they can. On one hand, you've got the people that are, interested in people, the other that are interested in results. Well, the 1 Minute Manager is one where we're interested in both people and results. And they have a quote inside it where the guy says, how in the world can I get results if not through people? Hard to argue with that right there. And one of the things that they don't mention in the book in regards to that specific aspect of management is that a manager has, many people's interests they're looking out for. So like an employee, somebody who doesn't have anybody that works for them, they have their own interests that they're looking out for, right? The people at the very top of the company, the stakeholders, the stockholders, right? The board, the governing board, they're interested in the welfare of the company because, which is, I guess, in their own self-interest as well, because if the company does well, they do well, right? So they're really interested in the company, where the manager, his job is to look out for the interests of the employee, to make sure the employee is getting treated fairly, getting compensated fairly, those sort of things, isn't being worked too hard, has a good work-life balance. But they're also interested in the interests of the company. That's their job, is to look out for the interests of both the company and the employee. And I would say on top of that, the manager is also interested in themselves, right? And making sure that they're taken care of. But so that's kind of the view of the responsibilities of a manager, right? A good manager is looking out for both the interests of the company and the interests of his subordinates. 1 Minute Manager, they refer to that kind of language, that kind of thinking, as people and results rather than interests of the company and interests of the employees. Hard to argue with that, though. And in order for the 1 Minute Manager, the techniques inside of it to work, they say the managers must genuinely care about the subordinates. And it's really not going to work if they really don't care about them. If they're just trying to kind of fake it to implement this method, but they really don't care, they just want results, it's probably not going to work. The people are going to see through that. So if you're not the kind of person that cares about the people that works for you, I would say management's probably not the job for you. You probably need a different kind of profession. So, because you're pretty much left at that point with just being the hard ass to get results out of people. And it's really not a fun position, I think, certainly not for the employees, but I'd say not for the manager as well. I don't think it's healthy for them, and it's not fun. It's stressful. And it's not nearly as effective either as somebody who actually cares about the people and the results, right? So you're just not going to be as good as somebody has skills that, someone who actually genuinely cares about their employees. So something to keep in mind. One of the things, another principle that they talk about that goes along with what I've been saying all along is that, they ask, do people who feel good about themselves produce more? That's one of the questions asked in the story. And the answer is, well, yes, of course. People who feel good about themselves produce more. I almost say that's self-evident. It's perhaps not, but I think we all know from our own experiences that, on days when we're feeling better about ourselves, we have more energy, we work harder, we're more focused, that sort of thing. And they also talk about another principle is that, production is both quality and quantity. So if you're producing a whole lot of work, but it's really shoddy, and someone else is going to have to go back behind you and fix your mistakes, or you're going to have to go back and do it again, or it's just pretty much completely worthless and has to be squished up into a tight ball and thrown in the trash can, then obviously that's not doing you any good. And at the same time, you produce something really high quality, but you're super slow at it. So the quantity of stuff you're putting out is not meeting expectations. You're not really producing there either. If you hired somebody to build a website, let's say, and the website has, maybe 5 main pages in it, right? And you're expecting them to have this website complete after 2 weeks based on your experience with other people who have done the job, and more competent web developers. And after 2 weeks, they have 1 page done and it's awesome. It's perfect, exactly how you wanted it to be. But it's just 1 page. It's just 1/5 of the results. You're like, my other web developers would do this in 2 weeks tops. Some of the fast ones would do it in 1 week and have all 5 pages looking amazing. That's not really being productive either, right? So it's, you have to keep those two things in mind, that people need to do quality work and work in quantity. So there's that kind of focus. And I think that's pretty much common sense. Once you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. So, but I have seen people advising people that were making mistakes and the like, that, they're like, don't worry about the time, just do it as, you have to make sure the work is high quality, right? And I guess maybe if you're just failing miserably until you get it down, maybe that is true, that you need to go slow until you've got it down. But at some point you need to start working on your speed, or else you're just not producing enough, right? I guess before I dive into what the actual methodology, now that we've got some of those principles in place, what some of the methodology is behind the 1 Minute Manager, I will just explain kind of the format. So it's actually done in an allegory style, where they have this guy who's looking for a good manager, and he wants to someday himself become a manager. And he goes into an office, and he's going around town and asking, about where can you find me a good manager? Where's a place that has a good manager, and interviewing people, and this is where he's finding, after interviewing several managers, they either care about people or they care about results. And they're either the ones that are pushovers or hard asses, right? And neither of them seem to be terribly effective to him. But all of them, both styles seem to be missing something. And then he finds this place where they say, oh, this manager is awesome. He calls himself the 1 Minute Manager. And they give to you the components of the system as in this story, as he's going and talking to the 1 Minute Manager and then talking to the people that work for him. You find out the different aspects of the strategy, of the management strategy, and why it's effective and that sort of thing, done in that format. And it's a really short book. I mean, I think it's 100 pages with a lot of pictures and a lot of big white margins, a lot of big margins for which is great for people who like to take notes and the like. But and even with all of that, it's still only 100 pages, so it may only really be 50 pages of text. So I did an audiobook, and I think the audiobook was maybe just 2 or 3 hours. So, you could definitely sit down in an evening and plow through this if you're so inclined. But the different aspects of the system, it's basically there are 3 components. It's 1 minute goals, 1 minute praisings, and 1 minute reprimands. He talks about how most people, if you ask them at places, he interviewed these various people, what is it you're supposed to be doing? And most people didn't know what it was they were supposed to be doing. And, he'd ask, well, how do you think you're doing on your job? And they would say, I don't know, because I don't know what it is I'm supposed to be doing. Or I guess I'm doing okay. I haven't been yelled at lately, that sort of thing. And so this goals is making it 1 minute goals is you write out your goals for the job. And each goal is on its own sheet of paper, and it should be 250 words or less. The idea is you should be able to read it in less than a minute or, thereabouts. And this would make it very clear what it is that the person is supposed to be doing, what success looks like. Not just what they're doing, but what it looks like when they're doing it well. That's what the goal would include, right? So what is a successful situation? What is a successful end product? What is the expectations that the manager has for the person? So, the one key component is writing it down. And that way the person can read it over and over again, and there's not any discrepancies between words that came out of someone's mouth and what they heard. Nothing gets lost in translation, right? You can always go back to it, and you can reread it as much as you want, and you can always, if you want to look it over once or twice a week and see, am I meeting expectations? Am I doing something that would be considered successful? Or my steps leading me towards completing my goals? And I think one of the final things that they said about successfully having a 1 minute goal is that agree on the goals, right? So it shouldn't be something that's dictated by the manager to the employee. And at the same time, it shouldn't just be set by the employee. I choose what my goals are going to be, and whether this, meets the interests of the company or my manager's expectations or not, Of course, they have to both agree on that. So I thought, that makes a lot of sense. And, I'm liking it so far, what I've read. 1 minute goals makes a lot of sense. Doesn't take a lot of time, but pretty effectively shows the employee what good behavior looks like and what your expectations are. So the next part was 1 minute praisings. So, they said a lot of managers are sitting around waiting to catch somebody doing something wrong. And they said instead what you should be doing is you should try to be catching them doing something right. Because, I think if you've looked into self-help or relationships or management leadership kind of stuff, over and over again, there's a recurring theme of praise is much more effective than criticism. So it's kind of like you want to emphasize the positive. You get more of what you emphasize. So if you're emphasizing the positive, you're going to get more of that. And that's something, you see it in parenting, you see it in management, you see it, in romantic relationships, whatever. But praise is much more effective than criticism. So I'm on board so far with what they're saying, and some of the things that that they kind of work in, that the steps that they say, what's different about this than just complimenting it. What makes a 1 minute praising? First of all, it's brief. It should be 1 minute, and you want to praise them immediately when you catch them doing it, not kind of just wait, stretch it out, and collect your praisings, and give them to them, once a year or something in their annual review or whatever. Tell them immediately when you caught them. Be very specific. Tell them what it is they did right. So you're not just kind of, oh, you're doing a great job, that a boy, you want to specifically point out what it is that you like that they're doing. And then here's the thing that I thought was really good is they talk about, you want to tell them how you feel about it. How does their behavior make you feel about what they did right, and how it helps the organization and other people who are working for them there. So that's really important to express your feelings. That's something you don't hear often in other areas where they say, praise more than criticism. That's great, but I like this tying the feeling into it. It also kind of ties in a nonviolent communication aspect to it as well, where in nonviolent communication, you always include the feeling, whether you're pointing out a time when your needs are not getting met, which would be, the standard way of handling that would be to criticize somebody. Nonviolent communication, you don't, but you point out your feelings there. But also in nonviolent communication, you point out your feelings whenever you're happy about something, when your needs are being met. And the 1 minute manager includes that in there, include the feeling, and then they say to stop for a minute and let them, in that moment of silence, feel how good that you feel, and he recommends like put a hand on them, that there be physical contact, or shake their hand or something. And that really helps to kind of cement it, and then you, after that brief pause, you encourage them to do more of the same. That all sounds really solid to me. I like that they're including the feeling in there. And I like the idea of touching someone too. He does say in there that when you're touching someone, only do it in a scenario where that person trusts you. That the employee knows that you genuinely care about them, that you're genuinely looking out for their interests. Because otherwise, they're probably not going to like you touching them. So that also seemed like something that was pretty good advice as well. I mean, the touch, I think there's a lot of power in a touch. I mean, one of the most powerful things you can do is give somebody a hug. Now I don't know that necessarily when you're praising someone at work, when you're the boss and that you should be going up and hugging your subordinates or whatever. That might not be professionally appropriate, but that touch component I think can be really nice. If as he says, the person knows and that they know that you genuinely care about them, then it makes sense. So, and another thing he talks about is he says, and this is really important for new employees, is to be watching and trying to catch them doing something right. And he said, look for baby steps. In the beginning, they're probably not going to be able to do the whole job with high skill and grace, right? They're going to have baby steps along the way as they're learning and stumbling and falling and getting up and trying again. So he said, every little time you catch them doing something, give them a 1 minute praising. And that's going to be really important in the beginning. And as the further on they go, you don't have to do this quite as often, right? To where somebody who's really locked in on their position and knows what they're doing well, and you built that relationship up, it can be a lot more infrequent. But, he says with adults, we don't tend to praise them for small steps. We wait till they've completed the whole job or something like that, which is really hard for somebody that's new, and they give the example of, they truly give the example of baby steps, right? They said, with an infant, do you wait for the child to get up and walk across the room before you say any comment? No, it's like the first time they're able to stand up on their own, they're wobbling, and maybe they take a half step and then fall. You're praising them, telling them how great they are and how wonderful that was. And the child's like, oh, that's interesting. And then they get up and they try again and they make another step and then they fall and you're like praising them again. And, he says, but why would we treat adults any differently? When you're learning some new task, it's not reasonable to expect them to just stand up and stride across the room, to complete the task effectively, efficiently, with high quality right away if they're learning something new. So it is something that's praiseworthy when they have a step, when they get a little bit closer to their goal, and then they get a little closer to their goal, and then they get a little closer to their goal, that sort of thing. That seemed to make sense as well. And then the third piece that they really emphasized was the 1 minute reprimands. And so this, one of the aspects to this is, you find somebody who's not moving towards their goals and something needs to be said, you step in and you reprimand the behavior, but only the behavior, not the person. You have to make sure that it's the behavior. So this is kind of the steps for it. You reprimand their behavior. You tell them how you feel. Maybe you're frustrated or you're upset or whatever. You stop for a moment of silence to allow them to feel how you feel, right? Give them a chance to let that sink in. And then you shake hands or you touch them or whatever, and then you praise them. And this is, you're like reminding them of how much value they have, and, you reaffirm that you think well of them, but it's just not their performance in this situation, but they still have value as a purpose. You still think a lot of them, and you wouldn't even be taking the time to do this 1 minute reprimand if you didn't really care about them and want to see them succeed, right? And then when it's over, it's over. This should just really be 1 minute, and then you let it go. And, they say sometimes it's not always a minute, but it should be pretty short. It should not take a lot more than that. And, you're investing in the person when you do this, right? You think about reprimands that occur outside of 1 minute management. It's pretty often not 1 minute. It's pretty often long and painful. Oftentimes it doesn't include this praise. And another thing, when it does include praise, it'll often be at the beginning, which I think isn't effective. For whatever reason, you have to have it at the end, not the beginning. So if you start off and say, oh, I think the world of you, Bob. You're a great guy, and normally you produce all this great work. But in this situation, you really messed up. It's like the but just completely negates everything you just said before it. So they didn't even, at that point, they're not even hearing it. It's completely gone, and they're just focusing on the negative. So it just, for whatever reason, psychologically, the praise has to come after. And, then you reprimand them, let them know what they did wrong, but then you soften it by telling them, you still care about them, and let them know, again, that it's just the behavior. They don't have any less value as a person, right? So I think all of that seems really, really, really strong. And again, I like the aspect of bringing the emotion into it. Again, to me, it has an NVC feel. I like, again, the touch. I think that's a really nice, that's a really nice touch to add in a touch. Yeah, it just seems like this was probably pretty effective. And yeah, I've certainly used this in the past. Not, I haven't used the 1 minute manager since I've read it, because I just read it yesterday. I at least haven't done a 1 minute reprimand. I did do a 1 minute praising earlier this morning, which felt really good, actually, to just share my feelings in the praisings. Not just, normally I would just tell the person, what it is they did right and then praise them for it. But it felt good to add in there my feelings and how that benefited the whole company and the like. So I really like that aspect. I'm going to bring that more often to the table in my management. And I think, next time there's an opportunity for a reprimand, I'm going to use this as well. And, to be honest, this pointing out the behavior and not the person being at fault also reminds me of NVC. So, in NVC, they talk about basically pointing out the behavior would be the observation component of speaking with NVC. So in NVC, they say, don't talk about the person so much, but just talk about what you observed. It's like when I came home from work and I saw that the dishes weren't done and I was expecting them to be done, I felt frustrated because my need for understanding, was maybe not being met. Now, maybe that's because you had agreed to this before, that you were going to do it, blah, 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 whatever. But the observation is, I saw the dishes were not done. Or at work, when I saw that the deadline was missed and I never received any notification ahead of time saying that the deadline was in danger of being missed, I got upset, because in your goals, in our 1 minute goals, we had it, one of your goals being that if you were not going to make a deadline, you would let me know so that I would have time to help you out. Maybe I could reallocate some resources to help you out so that you made the deadline. Or I could, if the deadline was just going to be missed, I could start communicating with the customer or whatever and let them know that it was going to be missed, and we could maybe make some contingencies or whatever, or just at a minimum at least soften the blow that they know it's coming. Nobody likes to get hit with surprises, right? That sort of thing. So it did really remind me of almost an MVC aspect of reprimanding the behavior, not the person. And then, that whenever you look at the 1 minute manager, like if you look at any other book reviews are out there, I just quickly scanned a couple of them, after I'd read the book, after I'd, jotted down my notes and made my own opinions on what I wanted to talk about. I then went out and read some other reviews. I don't like to read the reviews first before I've got basically my own review set in my head, because I don't want that to sway me. I want to be able to have my own original thoughts about it, right? But I did go out and check out the other reviews, and they all mention 1 minute goals, 1 minute praisings, 1 minute reprimands. Like, this is the methodology. Some of them get into the philosophies behind it, some of the guiding principles of, being interested in people and results, of, genuinely caring for your subordinates, and people that feel good about themselves, produce more, those sort of things. Some of them didn't include that, but they all included 1 minute goals, 1 minute praisings, 1 minute reprimands. One thing I didn't hear a single one of them talk about this, but to me it was a pretty important one, is they also included in the book having a weekly meeting, a weekly team meeting. And the manager says in there, he's like, I just mostly listen. So, so we get together once a week for 2 hours. I think 2 hours is a little long, personally. 2 hour meeting is kind of brutal to sit through, in my opinion. You start to really fade towards the end. I'd say 1 hour is much better for this sort of thing. That's what I do with my team in our weekly meeting. And often we don't make it all the way through the hour before we have to, sometimes we're done with our business after a half hour. In general, I don't even like hour meetings. I prefer 30-minute meetings. And, and sometimes if you can get it done in 15 minutes, great. And I plan on actually doing a whole podcast on meetings at some point, how to have effective meetings, efficient meetings. But 2 hours seems really long. But anyways, that's what they said in there. Once a week, 2 hours. The manager says, I mostly listen. And they said, what happens in these meetings is my employees, they talk about what they accomplished the last week, what struggles they had, and then we plan out what the next week is going to look like. I think that's really important to know. I mean, you need to keep that communication going. Having a weekly meeting makes a big difference. It makes a big difference to you as a manager to stay on top of things, and it makes a big difference to your teammates to make sure that they still know they're heading in the right direction. People can learn from each other's mistakes that way because you talk about what your struggles had been, right? And you can share it, and sometimes this will help, people to not have to reinvent the wheel because you've figured out how to already get past one struggle. So the next time someone on your team encounters that, they'll be like, oh, that's right. Jack, you had this problem before, right? What's the fix for that again? Could you send me the document where you documented how to fix that? Or sometimes somebody will be talking about a struggle they're having, and in the meeting, someone will say, oh yeah, I know how to get by that. Here, I'll work with you on that and help you get through it. So those things are really good. And just, there's definitely people having a bigger picture of what's going on in the team, I think helps for people to do higher quality work. There's less stepping on toes and more understanding what the end goal is. They might be working in their separate areas, but they get a better understanding of what the end goal is when you have these team meetings like this. And yeah, the manager doesn't have to do a lot of talking. The manager's there to kind of set the stage. And I definitely agree with that. I mean, I basically just, in my team meetings, I set the stage for my team to solve the problems. I don't set out to solve the problems for them or tell them how they should be doing their jobs. I just provide a framework for it. And there's a lot of great things that come with that, but not the least of which is you get the team to buy in. If they're the ones that are coming up with the solution, they buy into the solution, where if you dictate it to them, if it's coming down from on high, a lot of times there'll be resentment. A lot of times there'll be pushback. A lot of times they might not even want to see it succeed because, it was something that was forced on them. Where meanwhile, if they make it themselves, they want to see it succeed. Everybody wants to be successful, and it was their idea, right? They're like, and so they're fully behind it and trying their hardest to make it succeed because everybody wants their idea to work out, right? So I thought that was a really big piece, was his meeting component. One of the things that they said in there that, other than these 3 1-minute management practices and, one weekly team meeting, there was very little contact or additional oversight required. The manager is free to do other stuff, to work on, big plans and maybe relationships with the customers or various things of that nature. He doesn't have to worry about managing people themselves because it's taking very little of his time. There's these 3 little tactics that are 1 minute piece that you don't have to do all that often. Goals, depending on what your goals are, I could see those changing very infrequently, and once they're set, and you shouldn't have that many of them. 1 minute praisings, maybe something where you're praising an employee once they're up and running. In the beginning a little more, but once they're up and running, it's probably just every couple weeks, few weeks, right? And reprimands probably less than that. I think your praising should always outnumber your reprimands quite significantly, right? I think I've read in books that they say, for every 1 criticism, you need 5 praises, to counteract that, or else the relationship starts going sour. And that's just to get you to break even. So, kind of keep that in mind. That's a good principle for all areas of your life, right? Not just at the workplace. And then one of the things they also mentioned in the 1 Minute Manager is to make sure you always start off with praisings. Catch them doing something right before you go in with a reprimand. And, you want there to be some foundation built on the house before you come in with your wrecking ball, right? So The praisings, always make sure you've had at least a couple praisings before you come in with a reprimand was another point that I failed to mention earlier. But there's not that much time required to manage people. You've got a 2-hour meeting. Well, I would say you just need a 1-hour meeting. And, these little 1-minute practices that, you're probably only, depending on how large your team is, you're probably only doing them a handful of times a week, and they're a minute a piece. I mean, come on, so it's like 5-10 minutes a week on doing these things, unless you've got a really large team, right, with a lot of new people. But otherwise, you're probably only doing those 3 things: 1-minute goals, 1-minute praisings, 1-minute reprimands, 5 to 10 times a week, so 5 to 10 minutes. And the rest of the time, you're free to work on the other responsibilities you have. So very efficient, very effective. Like I said, am I a 1-minute manager? Have I implemented all of these things? No, I just read the book, but they all make a lot of sense to me. I was already more or less doing the meetings. Well, I would say I was already doing the meetings, just a shorter version of 1 hour instead of 2 hour. I was already doing essentially 1-minute praisings and 1-minute reprimands. In the past, when I would do reprimands, I would do the sandwich technique. So, which is you praise someone, then you show them what they're doing wrong, and then you praise them again. I was pretty close. So I was pretty close to doing the 1-minute reprimands. I like that they talk about in here that the really focusing in on the behavior, making sure you're focusing in on the behavior, and including that feeling in there. So I think that's going to be something I'm going to start doing going forward. And with 1-minute praisings, I was always very big on praising my employees when they did things right. But now I'm going to make sure I include that emotion part, put the feeling in there. And, it's just kind of bringing focus to all the aspects of it, that being very specific about what they did right is very important. I wasn't always specific when I would tell people. Sometimes it'd just be like, good job. I need to be more specific than that. And then also, you include the feelings, include how they're impacting the organization, how they're impacting their coworkers, right? That's really good stuff. So, I was pretty close to doing some of these things already, but I was definitely not doing them exactly like this. And I'm gonna try it out going forward, and I think it's gonna work pretty well. I mean, the theory sounds really, really strong. And the 1-minute goals thing I was not doing. We have kind of a specific way we handle goals in our company, and I'm going to stick with that for right now and see, because we just implemented it actually just a few months ago, and I'm going to see how that works out. I kind of like conceptually the 1-minute goals better, to be honest, but I'm going to stick with the way our company is doing goals right now and see how that works. And if it doesn't work going forward, I might just scrap it and go with 1-minute goals. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I think this was pretty solid, and I recommend it. Check it out. And like I said at the beginning of the show, this could be good for anywhere where you're in a leadership position. So not just at work, but in your family, maybe a club or something like that. These techniques will still work as well, for sure. So, and I think even outside of a leadership position, even just in your relationships, 1-minute praisings, 1-minute reprimands, they're certainly better than how most people operate in their relationships with their friends and partners and the like, right? So there's definitely some really good things in there. Like, how many people make sure when they're complaining about something, when their needs aren't being met, how many people make sure that they're only pointing out the behavior, they're only reprimanding the behavior and not the person? In my experience, not very many people, right? Maybe if you're a giraffe, if you're into NVC, that you're doing that, but if you're not, it's definitely something that will improve your communication with others when you're in those situations when your needs are not getting met and you need to say something about it, to focus in on the behavior and let the other person know how you feel, and to make sure that they know you care about them as a person and all that stuff. So I think even beyond leadership positions, these techniques can be used for any relationship, really. All right, I think I've said enough about that. You get the idea. I don't want this podcast to end up taking longer than it would take you to just go read the book. So we'll close it up there. As always, thank you so much for listening in. It's really, really special to me. Each and every one of my listeners, I love you all. So I really enjoy getting feedback from you. The Facebook group is a great place for that. Look me up on Facebook. There's links to all of that in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, go to Patreon. Again, there's a link in the show notes there. Really, really appreciate that. And I think you'll find value in it as well. I try to put high quality stuff in my bonus content that's only available on Patreon. So check it out. And yeah, take care of yourselves. Have a great day. Or not. The choice is yours.